Well, hey, we're beginning a new teaching series today. And let's see if we can get it up here. Sermon on the Mount. I'm excited about it. I think it covers one of the most brilliant sets of teaching that has ever been conceived of, ever done in the world. It's a practical teaching. It's challenging. It's encouraging. It's the kind of thing, this whole Sermon on the Mount, that if we all lived the way this went, the way it's taught, it would literally change our lives. It's found in Matthew 5, 6, and 7. There's a portion in Luke as well, but we're going to focus in Matthew. And these three chapters have probably had more articles, more papers, more books, more sermons than any other passage in the entire Bible. There are so many. It's been praised by those who follow Jesus and by those who want nothing to do with Jesus. Mahatma Gandhi spoke very highly of this. It was one of those defining things in his mind of what it would look like to be a Christ follower. Dietrich Bonhoeffer said it's the essence of discipleship. John Adams, ex-president of the United States, said that this sermon contained his entire religion. Karl Marx, atheist, challenged Christians by saying, you guys should live up to that, because that's amazing. Harry Truman said this, I do not believe there is a problem in this country which could not be settled if approached through the teaching of the Sermon on the Mount. It's been pulled apart, it's been scrutinized, it's been praised, it's been taught, it's been criticized, and all of that for good reason. So we're going to spend the next few months going through this, and I'm excited because I think it's going to be great for us. Anybody here ever heard of Ignaz Semmelweis? Probably not. It was a Hungarian doctor. He worked in the Vienna General Hospital back in 1846. And what he noticed when he worked in the hospital was that there was a greater proportion of women who were giving birth, and then the mothers subsequently were dying. They were getting sick, they were getting ill, they were dying. And this was happening more in the hospital being run by doctors than in the midwifery building that was right next door. And he's like, why are more women dying in this childbirth experience in the hospital than with midwives? And so he started doing some research. He started digging into it and trying to figure out. And what he found was, this is what he found out, is that the doctors routinely performed autopsies and then came and delivered babies. And of course, that was the difference, because in the midwifery, of course, they didn't do autopsy, they just delivered babies. And he thought, okay. So the conclusion he came to was that they were carrying some type of particle, remember this is the 1840s, they were carrying some type of particle from these cadavers that were infecting or causing these women to become sick. And there was a higher incidence of mortality. Do you know what his solution was? Wash your hands. And so they did this, and it resulted in a remarkable drop in mortality. But here's the problem. The conventional wisdom of the day said that water was a potential cause of disease. And if you washed your hands, you put your patients at risk. So it didn't catch on. A few years later, if you're familiar with Florence Nightingale, she actually championed hand washing because some people had heard about it. But the medical wisdom, again, of the time says, no, it's these miasma odors that are causing infections. So we don't want to wash our hands. It seems crazy now, doesn't it, that this is a problem? Despite all the evidence, do you know when the US CDC first endorsed hygienic hand washing guidelines? The 1980s. Crazy, isn't it? And we look back and we think, well, that's just stupid, because of course we know what this is. We know that washing your hands, goodness, we just went through a pandemic and they talked about it ad nauseum, but we know there's something about that that's healthy. The reason I tell that story is when Jesus did the words of the Sermon on the Mount, everybody that was listening to him had conventional wisdom on what was, and the Sermon on the Mount takes all of that and flips it on its head. Let me give you an example. People, when Jesus was there, people knew, this wasn't just, we think, people knew that if you were blessed, it meant that God or the gods were in your corner. I mean, that was just the proof that you were in a good relationship with God. That's what the blessings proved. They knew that the rich and powerful had the favor and of God, that if you had all that stuff, that meant that, God was in your corner. People just knew this. It was just a fact of life. People knew that you had to earn God's favor, at least to some degree, through the things you did. That was just incontrovertible. That's what people knew. People knew that divorce was okay as long as you did it right. People knew that life was generally bad for most people and that there was no hope, especially if you were poor and you just kind of had to live with it because that's the way the world was. People just knew that. Everybody believed that from the top to the bottom, from the rich to the poor. People knew that if you did certain things, you would only do them if you could get an equal reward back, because that was just the way of the world. People just knew that that's the way life worked. And we could go on and on. People just knew that this was the way it was. And so the reason this is so important is we look at the Sermon on the Mount, we're like, okay, we've heard it so many times, this all kind of makes sense. Yeah, we don't really live it necessarily all the time, but we kind of have heard it, we've understood it. But to the first listeners, this was completely opposite. It turned everything upside down. And that's why people said, what is this teaching? And it's just as applicable today as it was back then. And I wonder, and the reason we're doing this series is because, while we know a lot, I wonder how much we live our lives where we know it here, we don't know it here. And that if we could just understand and live by and internalize what Jesus is teaching here, how much it would change how we live. And it would result in a completely different looking life. A question I think that applies whether you've been a follower of Jesus for a month or 50 years. So here's the main idea that I kind of want to run with, and this is going to go through the entire series, and it's simply this. Living the way of God's kingdom, and we're going to talk about that in a second, is the path to life as it was meant to be. And throughout this sermon, we're going to find out Jesus defines not only what we are to think and do, but what that life looks like. So Matthew records it on the heels of, if you read through the book, Matthew is someone who kind of traveled with Jesus, and he wrote a lot of this stuff down. And he had just spent a few verses before saying, okay, Jesus was traveling around telling people the good news of the kingdom. He mentions it several times. And then he follows that right on the heels with this long sermon or collection of sermons that Jesus gave, which is essentially what the good news of the kingdom is. In other words, okay, Jesus is spreading the good news of the kingdom. Well, what is that? What does that look like? Well, here it is. Now, the people that were listening to Jesus, they already knew what the good news of the kingdom was. Or at least they thought they did. To the people that were listening to him, mostly Jews, they knew that the good news of the kingdom of God was that God was going to send somebody who was going to bring freedom to Israel, freedom from their oppressors, political freedom from their enemies, that they would become blessed, that even the poorest of the poor would now have more than they needed, that the level of economic benefit would rise for everybody, that there would be this harmony because they were no longer being pushed or bothered by anything else. They could just be God's blessed people. They knew that. They'd read their Bibles. They just knew that that was the good news of the kingdom of God. Keep that in your mind as we look through the first verses, because it begins like this. Now, when Jesus saw the crowds, he went up on a mountainside and sat down, which is a typical rabbinic pose for a rabbi. They would sit and they would teach. His disciples came to him and began to teach them. So you notice two groups of people here, right? The crowds and the disciples. This is primarily aimed at his disciples, but there was obviously a crowd that had gathered around. So you could just picture Jesus sitting on the mountain, which, by the way, is very interesting because he's reframing the entire kingdom on a mountain, and it was on a mountain that Moses was given the original commands. And now he's on a mountain saying, let me tell you what it all means. So he's teaching his disciples and letting the crowds listen in. They're a part of this. So you got to think he's got both audiences in mind as he's teaching. And he begins with these very famous set of statements called the Beatitudes. And he goes like this: Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted. Blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the earth. Blessed are those who are hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they will be filled. Blessed are the merciful, they will be shown mercy. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they will see God. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called children of God. Blessed are those who are persecuted because of righteousness, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are you when people insult you, persecute you, and falsely say all kinds of evil against you because of me. Rejoice and be glad, because great is your reward in heaven, for in the same way they persecuted the prophets who were before you. Now, before we jump into the details, a couple things to note. The modern church has spiritualized to a certain degree that word blessed, right? We think, okay, well, you're blessed. Doesn't mean things are going well, but you're blessed. But if you look at the original language, when Jesus spoke it, it actually meant happy. It had an element of blessing to it, but he was saying, look, you're happy. And if you read some translations, they'll actually change this word to happy, right? In our English, blessed kind of gets the bigger term, but if you want to catch the full context, you have to think of it not just in terms of blessing, but in terms of there's an emotional, there's a reactionary component that says, if I live this way, this is good. Life is better. I'm happier if I live this way. Very interesting. And so, again, that's kind of one of those interesting things. And then the other thing to notice, as you go through these statements, they give a blessing. They say, okay, you're blessed if you're like this because this is going to happen. And sometimes that doesn't sit well with us because it's almost like, well, it seems like Jesus is saying if I do these things, I get a reward. So if I'm going to do these things so that I'll get something from God. And while there is, obviously, we love and we serve God because of who He is and what He's done for us, Jesus is clearly laying out, hey, if you live this way, there's a benefit. I think it's almost like an enticement. Like when you tell your child, hey, if you do the right things, if you say the right things, if you're polite to grandpa and grandma, if you say thank you, there's a reward over here, and the child may not fully get it. You want them to be good just because you want them to be good, but sometimes there's an incentive. And so Jesus is laying all these things out, saying, look, there is blessing here, and I want you to understand that there's value to doing this. So there's a component to that. So let's take a look, because as we go through this entire thing, and by the way, we could spend a week on every single one of these statements. We're not doing that. We're putting them all in the next 13 minutes, right? So what I want you to grasp, though, is that this is like an overview, a summary, or he categorized, these statements are in 3 categories, that basically everything he says after, for the next 2 months that we're going to look at, falls into these categories. And so they're really 3. The first is, the first 4 Beatitudes are all about your attitude, what you think. The next 3 are about what you do, and the last ones are about the result. Okay? And everything else he teaches after this fits into one of those frameworks. Let's take a look at them one by one. Because if we are going to live with this kingdom minds, if we're going to have this live the kingdom ways, it starts with having a kingdom mindset. In other words, it starts with what we think, what we believe, what's going on in our attitudes. And so he gives 4 ways of thinking that he does here. And what's the first? Poor in spirit. He says, all right, blessed are the poor in spirit, which, by the way, is probably a direct quote. Jesus is quoting from Isaiah 61. So if you're the person who likes to go back, a lot of these are just, he's tying back to the Old Testament. He says, and if you look at Luke, by the way, he says, blessed are the poor. Doesn't say the poor in spirit. He says the poor, people who have nothing. And the 2 concepts are very intimately connected. And that's because this whole idea behind a poor in spirit is simply this. They're people with a sense of powerlessness. And in this culture, the people who were poor had no power at all. They were run over by the rich. The rich could do whatever they wanted, whenever they wanted. They could buy justice. They could buy, whatever they needed to get. The poor were the ones who paid the price. They paid the taxes. They lived day to day. They didn't know if they were going to have enough to live or die. I mean, it was just crazy. So they were completely helpless. And he says, look, when you're finally in that position where you have to trust because you recognize your powerlessness, and then he expands it saying, and it's not just that, but you realize you can't save yourself. There's nothing you can do. You are spiritually bankrupt. You cannot bring anything to the table. When you finally get to that point, that's a good thing. You're blessed because of that. You absolutely recognize your need for God, this idea of personal unworthiness and just realizing you can't do it. And it's very much tied to the second one. They kind of almost frame each other. Because then he goes on to say, blessed are those who mourn. And this isn't just blessed are those, who had someone die and then they cried. This is so much deeper than that. It's tied to the statement before, which is, hey, those people that have finally realized they can't make it on their own, they are just wrecked. There's nothing in there. This is why rich people struggle, because they don't feel like they have any needs. He says, no, when you realize that you have nothing, that you are the kind of person that needs intervention from other places to have anything good in this life, when you finally get to that place and you begin to mourn your spiritual bankruptness, that's when everything shifts. It's when everything changes. They see their personal state and it drives them to feel sorrow and to repent. And I will say this, because I think this applies to myself and a lot of people, is that too few Christ followers truly grieve their sin. We excuse it, we blame it, we make it about circumstances, we make it about the other person. I'm not as bad as them. But it's interesting, by the way, that you cannot have, because the promise here is they will be comforted. Do you realize you can never be comforted if you have no grief? If you went through life and never, ever had grief, you'd never need comfort. He goes on, he says, well, but there's another attitude, because these who mourn are just those people who recognize their state. They're letting them drive to sorrow and repentance. But he says, but by the way, I want the meek are blessed as well. But these are people who are just committed to the ways of God. This idea of meekness is of a spiritual poise and strength. This is one of those words that's been wrecked in the English language, right? Because no guy ever went to a guy and said, dude, you're so meek. It's just not happening, right? We're not going to have those conversations. This is just, no, I don't want to be that. But that's not what the whole point is, right? You've heard these things before, right? This is more about power under control. But when you look at it the way Jesus is talking about, he's saying, look, these are people who don't have to get angry. They don't have to react, because they can absorb adversity without lashing out, because they're trusting. They're letting God be God. So you don't have to do it. You don't have to get angry. You don't have to spout off on social media. You don't have to get on someone else. You don't have to complain. God's God. Let him be God. That's meekness. And then he finishes with this hunger and thirst for righteousness. And this is all talking about this, a desire to know God and his ways and live by them. Hunger and thirst. That's why he's talking about this hunger and thirst, this desire. Again, these are all connected to concepts from the Old Testament, quotes from the Psalms. This idea of, I want God. And I want to know what he says I should do, and then I want to do it. See, I wonder how many of us pursue God for what he gives us rather than who he is. It's just really, really easy to do. When my kids were little, I traveled a lot. I was in a different line of work. So I flew a lot, I traveled a lot, I was away a lot. And so Yvonne and I talked about this. And I made a point of almost never bringing gifts home to my kids. Because I knew a lot of guys, they were away, they'd start feeling guilty, they'd buy a present, they'd bring it home for their kids. But we talked about it and said, no, I want my kids to be glad that I'm home, not because of what Dad brought them. It's funny because I watch my own kids try and teach their kids, my grandkids, the same thing. Because there's something about saying, no, I value you more than I value what you can give me. And so Jesus is saying, look, so kind of put this all together. He says, because do you see the result, by the way? They will be filled. So the common thread in these first four statements is this idea of complete dependence on God. Somebody says, well, look, I can't accomplish this. I can't get where I need to go. I can't fix anything. I have to let God be God. I have to let him do what he's going to do. I'm going to operate like he's in charge, and I'm just going to passionately pursue him and his ways. And Jesus' whole point is, if you want to live in the kingdom, this is the kind of mindset that you have to live with. And then look what happens. All kinds of good things. Being completely filled. Being happier. Being satisfied. The promise that we actually are part of his kingdom, that we'll inherit blessings in this world and the full blessings of the next. I wonder if the grass is always greener somewhere else in your life, that maybe it's because the kingdom mindset is not altogether present in how you view the world. Maybe it's because your solution to the world's problems and your circumstances is better self-esteem, better self-reliance, better self-determination, more self-confidence instead of God esteem and God confidence and God's grace and God's mercy. Well, see, I told you there's so much here. We're going through this so fast. It starts with what we think, the mindset. But then Jesus goes on and says, okay, but then we have to be committed to kingdom behavior. It's not just what you think, it's also in what you do. And so he gives three more things here. He talks about the merciful. And this is pretty self-explanatory. This is exactly what James, the brother of Jesus, writes much later. It's those who see needy and distressed people and help lift them up. It's a merciful person. Right? It's someone who looks around and says, oh, you know what? Merciful people, they want to understand people more than they want to be understood. And understand, this is a lifelong pursuit. This isn't just a one-time thing. This isn't just okay, I was merciful one day. He's like, you need to cultivate a life that looks like this. And by the way, the reason this comes after the first is if you want to be a merciful person, do you know how you get there? Be a broken person. You cannot be a fully merciful person unless you are a fully broken person, because they're tied intimately together. If you show me someone who is not merciful, I will show you someone who has issues with pride and a preoccupation with themselves. We show mercy. Why? Because we've been shown mercy. It goes on. Pure in heart. These are people, I'll put it this way. He's basically talking about pursuing God with undivided allegiance. But if you want to really boil this down, this is who you are in the secrecy of your thoughts and your feelings when nobody else is watching. That's where this is coming from. It's about not being double-minded, about being a different person over here and a different person over there, or pursuing this really hard and then trying to pursue God at the same time. He's like, no, this is undivided, going after God. That's what you're supposed to be doing. That's how you spend your time. That's how you spend your energy. By the way, do you notice the first one was relational, merciful this way? What we do. This one is this way. And then the third one, peacemakers, is taking those two and bringing them together. God and people. Because peacemakers are simply those who don't live just at peace with God. They're agents of peace and reconciliation in the world. He says, I want you to live this way. You are an agent of peace. You're seeking to bring people together. You're looking to bring unity. You're fighting against disunity. And once again, he says, if you live this way, this kingdom behavior, look what happens. You receive and experience the mercy of God in ways you never had before. You will see God. You will experience Him. You will know Him in ways you've never done before. And you'll what? You'll be identified as part of His family. Do you see, by the way, this is very interesting. These are all salvation comments. We are shown mercy. He died on the cross for us. It's only when we come to Him and seek Him that we see Him for who He is and what He can do for us. And the result is that we're adopted into His kingdom. It's like Jesus is laying out here, you want to know what it is to be a follower of Jesus? To be a Christian? It's right there. Now, He lives one other piece in the end that's important for us to note, because we want to have this kingdom mindset and we want to have this kingdom behavior, and He's going to unpack this now for 3 whole chapters. But He says, by the way, here's what I want you to understand. Okay? This is what you're going to get, and you have all these blessings. But if you live this way, it's going to produce opposition. Because kingdom living always produces opposition. He says, blessed are the persecuted. And then he goes on, words that we don't really like. Blessed are you when people insult you. I've never yet felt blessed when I've been insulted, ever. Okay? But Jesus says, look, when this happens, you're blessed. When you're being persecuted. And you think, well, why? And by the way, this is not just for suffering. Understand what he's saying here, right? There is no inherent blessing just because we suffer, right? We live in a fallen world with all kinds of suffering. He's very particular. He says, blessed are you when you are persecuted. He gives us 2 things, because of righteousness or because of Jesus, which are connected. Same thing. Okay? He says, you're blessed when your lifestyle, your kingdom lifestyle, your commitment to pursuing me, the fact that you need to live by my ways, when that brings you into conflict with the world around you and you're persecuted, you're blessed. about 40% of the world's followers of Jesus understand this way better than we do, because they face it all the time. But if we live by this and have a kingdom mindset, you will invite opposition from those who oppose this kind of stuff. And it kind of goes like this, right? If you live a life of true righteousness the way he's talking about, what's it going to do with people who live unrighteously? Doesn't it make them uncomfortable? They don't kind of like it, right? You're the one at the party that makes everybody go, oh, why are you here? You're spoiling it, right? There's something about that that's uncomfortable. Or a life, so this life of righteousness is like a statement. It's like, if I'm a humble person, do you know what that exposes? Pride. If you're a proud person, what do? You respond to that. If you are a person with a lot of self-control, the person who lives to excess in all parts of their life, it's highlighted. They see it. And all of a sudden it's apparent. They start to feel guilty. If you're a person who forgives, it exposes the hearts of bitterness. And he says, look, you have to understand, guys, if you live this kingdom way, if you're merciful, you're not going to get shown mercy by the world. You get mercy from your Father. You're not going to get it from the world. If you're a pure in heart person, you will not be tolerated, but you'll see God. If you're a peacemaker, you will not have a comfortable and easy life, but you'll be my kids. And when you do good, do not expect anything back. And he's going to unpack this a little bit more. If you are a jerk and lose your job, do not say, I'm blessed because I was persecuted. Okay? Do you understand? That's not what he's talking about here. But when we say, oh no, I'm going to live according to kingdom principles and I'm not going to compromise and I'm going to do these, and if you lose a friend because you're judgmental and legalistic and uncaring, that's not suffering for Jesus. But when you say, no, I'm going to be that person who's merciful to others, who is pure in heart, and then stuff happens, okay, that's what Jesus is talking about. And the blessings really are twofold, because you actually get an identification with Jesus now. He says, look, you're doing this, you're suffering like every other person that's ever put the kingdom mindset and the kingdom behavior first. You're part of the group. You're in. You're like me. And there's a special connection, and you know this, because when you've lost someone and someone has died, and someone comes alongside who's also lost someone and had someone die, and they say, I get it, there's something unique about that connection. And Jesus is saying, look, when you suffer this way, there's a unique connection here. So let me finish with this. The Sermon on the Mount is kind of, you have to hold two things in hand on this. Because it's not a list of rules to follow to get God to love you. It is also not optional. You understand that? Jesus isn't saying, oh, by the way, if you kind of want to have a better life, you can pick and choose which ones of these you like, and it'll all be good. No. He's saying, no, you want to follow me? This is how the kingdom works. But you're not doing it to earn anything. This doesn't make you holy. This doesn't make you perfect like me. And it's funny, because we're going to come to where he actually tells them, I want you to be perfect and holy. But he says, you're not earning something here. This isn't what's going to make you the kind of person that God likes. That's not the point. He says, but this is not optional. And so we kind of hold these two things in conjunction all the time, which is there are no options. And if you're a Christ follower, this is how you should be living. And if you do, it's going to change some things, but they're the result, not the driver. Okay, we're going to come back to that over and over. So here's the thing we're going to do all throughout this. I'm going to ask you two questions every week. Same two questions, so start writing them down, start thinking about them. It says this, in what ways does your life, which is your attitudes and your actions, your mindset and your things, line up with these kingdom pathways? In other words, where do you do this? Because some of you are incredibly merciful people, and you're pure in heart, and you're being peacemakers. Where does your life line up where you go, yeah, I do that? When that's the case, celebrate it. Thank God for it. Say, that's so amazing, God, I'm so grateful for what you've taught me in this. I want to do more of this. Just be grateful. And then ask yourself this question. In what ways does your life need to grow to line up with these kingdom pathways? Because the degree to which we engage in all these things is the degree to which we experience the blessedness, the happiness, the life of the kingdom. So, if you really want to challenge yourself this week, if you want to go deep, Go through the list of Beatitudes. All right, God, where am I merciful? Where am I not merciful? Where have my statements divided? And where have I been a unifier? God, where is my primary hunger and thirst? Is it in you? Or is it a little bit over here? Celebrate what he shows you and lean into what is missing. If we do that, you'll be both encouraged and challenged as we go through this entire series.